My Uncle Johnny has given me a lot of advice over the years. Most of it bad. But one good suggestion he gave me when I was still in high school was to get into computers as a career. This in part led me to joining the U.S. Air Force, where I learned electronics and how to program. So with the shout out to my Uncle Johnny on his career advice out of the way, which unlike his stock tips was actually good advice, in honor of Veterans Day, I thought it would be fun to look back on some of my favorite air combat games for my favorite 8-bit computer, the Commodore 64. Hello, and welcome to Operation 8-Bit. I'm your host, Tony Landy, and over there, behind the camera, we have Sparky making sarcastic comments. For those of you who are new to our channel, keep an eye out for those. They're going to pop up from time to time during the video, and they're going to look something like this. The C64 was my first computer, and I can't tell you how much time I spent learning how to code on that thing. When I joined the Air Force, my C64 and Bill the Cat came with me. Although Bill didn't really help me out that much in my career, my experience with the C64 did. It opened up opportunities for me while I was in the service that ultimately led to my career as a computer programmer. So what I wanted to do for this Veterans Day episode is to pay homage to my Air Force background by taking a look back at some of my favorite air combat simulators for my favorite computer platform, the Commodore. And to keep it interesting, we're going to sprinkle in a little bit of military history here and there for good measure. And yes, we do know that this video is coming out a few weeks after Veterans Day. It's taken us a lot longer to get this one out the door than we originally planned. Well, that and my day job. But anyway, before we start, here's the obligatory call to remind you, if you haven't done so already, please hit the subscribe button. Also, make sure to stick around to the end of the video to catch some of the bloopers and outtakes from this episode. If you haven't seen these, you're really missing out on some of the fun that Sparky and I have between scenes. We'll start the list at number 5 with Hellcat Ace from Microprose. Released in 1983 for the Commodore 64, Hellcat Ace is set in the Pacific Theater during World War II. As the game begins, you're given a choice from about 20 scenarios of famous battles like Pearl Harbor, Wake Island, or the Battle of Midway. In each scenario, the documentation says that you are piloting a different plane. For example, in the mission Get Yamamoto, you're supposedly behind the stick of a P-38 Lightning. But in Guadalcanal, you're supposed to be flying the Grumman F-4F Wildcat. But despite what's in the instructions, the flight characteristics of your fighters always seem to remain the same, and the cockpit view never really changes. Not for nothing, but I do need to give the guys at Microprose a point or two for trying to maintain some level of historical accuracy. It was a P-38 piloted by Captain Thomas J. Landfair that shot down the Mitsubishi G4M Betty that was flying Yamamoto from Rabaul to Balele Airfield. So while the graphics could be improved, the simulator flies pretty well. Banking the plane left and right changes the horizon accordingly and giving a decent sense of a turn. Pulling back on the stick causes the plane to climb, and pushing it forward causes it to dive. no surprise. But aircraft velocity is actually handled pretty well. The plane gains speed as the altimeter unwinds in a dive, and you can stall your plane if you try to climb too steeply with too little engine power. You can even pull off aerobatics like loops, barrel rolls, Immelman turns, and these are all well described in the instruction manual. Now, although there is a gun sight, it's manual, so as you're shooting you need to correct for the effects of gravity, plane velocity, turning, etc. It doesn't take too long to get the feel for this, but be prepared to waste a lot of ammunition at first. In the lower levels, enemies are pretty easy to take down, and you can take them out with a single shot, compared to the higher levels where they're a little more advanced and it takes multiple hits to kill them. The instructions say that if you're hit by the enemy aircraft, you can bail out. But honestly, I've never been able to pull this off without dying in the process. Anyway, all in all, Hellcat Ace is a decent flight simulator with enough varying difficulty to interest both professional and novice pilots. Coming in at number 4 is another Microprose title, MIG Alley Ace. Released a year after Hellcat Ace, this game takes us a few years forward to the Korean War, and it gets its name from the area over North Korea near the Chinese border that was named MIG Alley by the UN pilots who fought the world's first large-scale jet-to-jet air battles there. As with Hellcat Ace, there are different scenarios based on actual encounters from the war. And along with a brief overview from the war in general, the instruction manual does a really nice job of providing a historical summary of these events and the actual aircraft involved. Flight controls and characteristics are pretty much the same as the other Microprose titles, but I think the graphics on this one are slightly better. The sprites for the enemy aircraft are still monocolored blobs, but there's enough detail that you can see little things like the swept-back wings of the MiG. What really sets MIG Alley Ace apart from Hellcat Ace and Spitfire Ace is that it has a 2-player mode available via split screen, and that each scenario can be played solo, cooperatively, or head-to-head. Another interesting feature of this game is that it incorporated a noteworthy anti-piracy measure. When you first start the game, you're presented with this screen asking for a response code from the manual to authenticate. Type in the wrong code, and everything works, but you only have enough ammo for one shot, making the game pretty useless. I guess the idea was that no one was going to have the time or resources at the time to photocopy the entire instruction manual, and that would keep people from pirating the game. Now, I will agree that copying the entire manual was probably out of the question for most kids at the time. But handing over a simple list of letter number codes to your buddy for him to write down was definitely doable. For number 3, we're going to go back to World War II and jump in the cockpit of a British RAF Mosquito fighter bomber with Ace of Aces. Developed by Artec Digital Entertainment and published in 1986 by Accolade, Ace of Aces has several missions, including intercepting German V-1 buzz bombs, sinking U-boats, rescuing POWs from a Nazi train, and downing Nazi bombers. Each real mission starts off with an intelligence report of the objective, the position of the enemy targets, weather conditions, and recommended weapons. From there, you go and load up your twin-engine RAF Mosquito with the necessary armaments and fuel to complete that mission. Now, you could arm yourself to the teeth here, But doing this is going to slow you down, giving you no chance in a dogfight with the ME-109s that you're going to be facing along the way. So you have to make really careful choices on the combination of rockets, fuel, and bullets that you're actually going to be carrying. Now, there is no takeoff or landing in this game, but instead, the designers did add this neat little sequence of the klaxon sounding, the pilots scrambling, and the ground crew kicking the chocks as they take off. Now, once in the air, you have 5 different points of view, and you flip between these by using either the keyboard or the joystick. The pilot screen shows the view out of the front of the window, and it's used to fly the plane as well as gun down enemy fighters. The engineer's port and starboard views are used to control the engines, and the bomb bay is used for aiming and dropping bombs on U-boats or the POW train, as well as switching between cannons and missiles. The final view is the navigator's map, and that helps you plot your position and course to the individual targets. Tying this all together is an intercom that flashes to direct you to any problems such as an engine fire or the bombardier telling you that the target is coming into sight. Now, the graphics on all this are pretty decent, and I do like the detail of the enemy fighters. They're not just gray blobs, and when you get close, you can even see the prop of the ME-109 spinning. The enemy aircraft can even duck in and out of the clouds, making them harder to hit. Now, in addition to the graphics and sound, I think what really makes this game stand out is how you need to keep everything coordinated between the different stations. And there are times that this can get pretty hectic as you're trying to jump back and forth between the different stations to adjust the throttle, change between guns and bombs, staying on course, and dogfighting a Messerschmitt that's trying to blow you out of the sky. At number 2 on the list is an all-time classic, F-15 Strike Eagle from Micropose. Released in 1985 for the Commodore 64, the 7 missions featured in this simulation of F-15 flight are actually all real-life missions the plane was originally used in. Gameplay starts off with you in the cockpit of an F-15 already in flight and equipped with a variety of missiles, bombs, drop tanks, flares, and chaff. And your mission is to fly your plane into combat and bomb various targets, including primary and secondary targets, while also engaging in air-to-air combat with enemy fighters. The graphics on this game can be a bit simplistic. Enemy fighters and SAMs are just line drawings, and your targets on the ground are just shaded blocks. But as you've seen with previous entries, this became kind of typical for flight simulators at the time. Game designers often had to sacrifice realism due to computing requirements and to maintain a level of playability. Now, to that point, this game is very playable, and it was a commercial blockbuster. It sold 250,000 copies by March 1987 and surpassed 1 million units in 1989. It ultimately sold over 1.5 million units and was followed by 2 sequels. Anyway, after you've taken out your targets, and hopefully before you run out of fuel, you head back to a landing on an awaiting aircraft carrier. Which, by the way, is a great example of sacrificing realism. In real life, the F-15 is not capable of a carrier landing. Sure, it has an arresting hook, but structurally, the airframe and the landing gear aren't strong enough for what is essentially a controlled crash onto the landing deck of a carrier in the middle of an ocean. Now, interesting side note, in 1971, McDonnell Douglas did propose a carrier version of the F-15 with the designation of F-15N that was unofficially dubbed the Sea Eagle, as an alternative to the Grumman F-14 Tomcat. The idea never made it past committee, and in the end, the Navy stuck with the Tomcat. But if they hadn't, the 1980s movie Top Gun might have had Tom Cruise in a different cockpit.
Good tone. I got good tone. I got tone. I got tone. Fire it!
For my top spot, I've chosen F-16 Combat Pilot by Electronic Arts. Developed by UK-based Digital Integration and released for the Commodore 64 in 1990, F-16 Combat Pilot still stands the test of time as an accurate simulation of the F-16 Falcon, given the hardware limits of its time. Dave Marshall of Digital Integration actually used to program real military flight simulators, and he had built up a huge library of technical specifications for the F-16C, and it clearly shows in the complexity and realism of this game. To get started, you need to enter an IFF security code. This is an anti-piracy measure similar to what we saw in MIG Alley Ace, but like everything else in this game, the developers took it to an entirely new level. Instead of relying on simple letter-number combinations, for this one, you're required to find a specific word in a specific paragraph on a specific page of the manual. Oh, and by the way, did I mention the instructions for this are over 100 pages long? Once you get past that, you can go into flight training or you can pick a mission. You have a choice between Scramble, which is dogfight, Hammer Blow, ground attack on military targets, Deep Strike, ground attacks on bridges, factories, infrastructure, Tank Buster, anti-tank, or Watchtower, which is a reconnaissance. From there, you head over to the hangar to fuel and arm your fighter, similar to what we saw in Ace of Aces. And just like Ace of Aces, your selections here will have a direct impact on the performance of your aircraft. A cool detail that the designers added here is that the airframe actually has G-force limitations based on store configurations, just like the real F-16 has. When fully loaded, the player can only pull 5.5 Gs instead of the 9 Gs that a clean F-16 is capable of. Now, unlike most other titles in this list, you don't just start off airborne on the way to your target, but instead you need to take off from a runway and then return to base and land when you've completed your mission. Taking off is pretty detailed. You fire up the engines, release the brakes, and start down the runway. But you need to be careful not to go too fast without lifting off or you'll damage the aircraft. Once airborne, you retract the landing gear and climb to altitude. And if you forget to retract the landing gear, you'll damage those while in flight. Landing your F-16 is just as accurate and very difficult. Unlike other combat simulations of its time, where you just lined up the plane on the runway at any angle or speed, in this one you actually have to master angle of attack and vertical velocity during approach. In the air, flight controls are smooth and your aircraft handles pretty well in multiple combat and weather conditions. As expected, you can pull off advanced aerobatics with ease, and the addition of the HUD as well as the artificial horizon help to keep you oriented and on track to your targets. Even on the Commodore 64, the graphics are pretty solid. Sure, the terrain and enemies are a bit simplistic, but the cockpit view is well detailed. The programmers claimed that this screen was based on the latest version of the F-16 at the time, and if you compare it to this real picture of an actual F-16C, you can see that they did do a pretty good job of getting everything right. The simulation has been thoroughly thought out in other areas as well. In this game, you aren't just flying single missions, you're actually taking part in campaigns for an entire war. And as that war progresses, missions become simpler or more complex as both sides inflict damage. And strategy, such as targeting factories and radar installations first, is required to actually win the game. Now, this sim is not for everyone, especially as those that prefer a more arcade-style game where you just jump in and start blowing bad guys out of the air. Despite that, this really is a great game that requires a lot of time to master and win. And if you're into strategic simulators, this one will keep you challenged for hours. Obviously, I really like this game and I could do an entire episode dedicated to it. But there is another reason that this game made it to my #1 spot. The F-16 was the jet that I worked on when I was in the US Air Force. And I even got the rare privilege as an enlisted member to get an incentive flight in one when I was stationed in Hill Air Force Base. I owe a lot to the Air Force for giving me the training and experience that led to my civilian career in IT, which is one of the reasons that Operation 8-Bit exists. Our mission is to support charitable organizations, like the Armed Services YMCA, by donating all the profits from any ad revenue that we make from this YouTube channel to organizations like theirs. Military life is unique, and for junior enlisted service members and their families, it can be challenging. Trust me, I know this firsthand. The ASYMCA provides programs and services designed especially for junior enlisted service members, their spouses, and their children, all of who sacrifice so much for us and our country. The recent health pandemic and the economic hardships that came along with it exacerbate the struggles of young military families that they already face. And with the holidays coming up amid all of the uncertainty, our military families can really use our help. And this is where you, our viewers, come in. The first part is the easiest. Subscribe to our channel. Like our videos. Next, if you have an old computer or video game system that you aren't using anymore, working or not, consider donating it. All the profits from the equipment you donate and we resell will go to support our charities. Finally, please consider supporting us on Patreon. As a Patreon supporter, you can help us offset the production costs associated with creating these videos. And to that point, we're coming to the end of our first season. And we have some great content planned for season 2. Not to spoil anything, but we have a fantastic episode on Zork that's already in production. And a very, very cool build for a Commodore SX64. We also have an Atari 1040 ST restoration that I swear should be a Halloween special. Seriously, Sparky, the condition of the donor machine is fucking scary. Anyway, we hope you enjoyed this episode, and we'll see you next time on Operation 8-Bit. Oh shit, I forgot how I wrote this thing. No. Sparky, are we having fun?
No. Not really.
This is why I drink. How'd it come off? Did I sound like a robot?
You sound like an empathetic robot.
This is why I drink.
That and your day job.